44 years of marriage taught me exactly one thing about love. It doesn't always come back to you the way you send it out. Sometimes the people you loved hardest are the ones who learn to lie to your face without ever blinking. My name is Naomi Washington. I am 68 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that if you loved people hard enough and stayed quiet long enough and forgave enough, that love would come back to you the same way you gave it out. That belief cracked wide open on a Tuesday morning in April, standing on a wooden dock behind my own house in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. Before I tell you what happened on that dock, sit with me a minute. Get comfortable, because this isn't just a story about a boat. It's a story about what a mother will forgive, what a woman will bury to keep peace in her family, and what happens the day the truth gets tired of waiting. If you love a good family drama, the kind that starts quiet and ends up shaking a whole household to its foundation, stay with me till the end. Now let me take you back to where all of it started, 9 months before that morning on the dock. My husband Darius and I had 44 years together, and it ended on an ordinary Sunday, the kind that gives you no warning at all. He was laughing with me at the kitchen table Saturday night about something so small I can't even remember it now. By the time I came downstairs the next morning, the coffee pot still gurgling on the counter like it didn't know the world had just ended, he was already gone. Heart attack, sudden, right there in the kitchen, his hand still reaching for the sugar bowl. I didn't know it yet, standing in that kitchen doorway with the coffee pot still running. That morning was only the first time the ground would drop out from under me. It would not be the last. And the second time, it wouldn't be grief that came for me. It would be my own son. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming and the phone stopped ringing every hour, I found that the only place I could still breathe easy was the dock. Darius built it himself, plank by plank, back when Jamal was still in diapers. It stretches out behind our house toward Charleston Harbor, and if you stand at the end of it at 6 in the morning, you can watch the light come up over the water like the whole world is being born again, one color at a time. That dock led to the boathouse, and inside sat the Legacy, a 1958 Chris Craft Capri, mahogany hull, chrome trim, the kind of boat men used to build with their hands and their pride instead of a factory line. Darius and I restored her together over 25 years. Every anniversary we'd add something new. New varnish, new upholstery, a brass fitting we'd found at a swap meet from Beaufort to Savannah. She wasn't just wood and metal. She was every year we'd survived together, floating right there behind our house. Every morning for 9 months, that walk down to the boathouse had been the only 40 feet in the world where the grief let me breathe. I'd stand at the workbench with my coffee, run my hand along the hull, and for just a few minutes let myself pretend Darius had only stepped out for coffee, not left for good. It was the one ritual grief hadn't managed to touch. That Tuesday morning, it touched it anyway. I walked down to the boathouse the way I did every morning, coffee in hand, still in my robe, hair wrapped, not another soul awake on the street yet. I pushed open the door. The cradle was empty. Not moved, not under a tarp. Empty. Water still standing on the clean concrete floor, dark drag marks where something heavy had been hauled out just hours before dawn. The door hadn't been forced. Nothing was broken. But when I looked up toward the little security camera Darius installed years back, I saw the wire had been carefully disconnected. Not torn, not damaged. Handled by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing and took their time doing it. Only 3 people in this world had keys to that boathouse. Me. Our dock manager, Mr. Griggs, who was 71 and hadn't set foot down there without me in over a year. And my son, my only child, Jamal. I called him with my hand shaking so bad I nearly dropped the phone twice. He picked up on the 3rd ring, and behind his voice I could hear an airport intercom, boarding announcements, the low roar of people rushing toward gates. "Jamal," I said, "where is your father's boat?" There was a pause, just long enough for my stomach to drop clean through the dock. "Mama," he said, and his voice had gone flat, careless, like he was answering a question about the weather. The boat's just been sitting there collecting dust. I sold it. Got a good price from a dealer over in Charleston, guy named Freeman. Aaliyah and I are about to board for Paris. She needed to get away, after everything with the funeral. It's been a lot on her. I couldn't speak. Gulls were screaming somewhere over the harbor, and I couldn't make a single sound come out of my throat. "Mama, it's just a boat," he said, and I could hear him half laughing, the way you laugh when you think you've gotten away with something small. "I just moved the timeline up a little, that's all." I just moved the timeline up a little. 25 years of Saturday mornings sanding that hole down to bare wood. 25 anniversaries where Darius would come find me in the boathouse with a new brass cleat wrapped in a dish towel, grinning like a boy, saying, "Got you something, Naomi." Reduced in one sentence from my husband's whole heart to just a boat. I stood there with my free hand pressed flat against the boathouse wall to keep myself upright, and something in me went very quiet and very still. Not peace. The stillness right before a storm decides which direction it's going to move. Standing there, a memory rose up I hadn't let myself sit with in 30 years. I remembered being 29 years old, 7 months pregnant with Jamal, sitting alone at our kitchen table past midnight, signing my name to a personal loan guarantee, putting every dollar of credit I had in this world on the line because Darius couldn't qualify for the boatyard financing on his own yet. I remember turning down a job offer from an accounting firm in Atlanta, a real career, because somebody had to stay in Mount Pleasant keeping the books straight while Darius built that business with his hands. Nobody ever brought it up again after it happened. Not Darius, not Jamal, not anybody. I let it settle into silence, the way I let so many things settle into silence when you're trying to hold a family together. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I don't even remember deciding to. I just remember the screen going dark in my hand and me standing there on my husband's dock in my robe, looking out over water that didn't care one bit about what had just happened to me. I didn't cry. I want you to know that. Whatever else this story is, it is not a story about a woman falling apart. I have cried plenty in my life and earned every one of those tears. But standing on that dock, something in me had gone past crying into a clear, cold quiet I hadn't felt since I was a young woman first learning what love actually costs. I looked out over that water and said it soft, just to the wind, just to whatever part of Darius might still be listening. "Jamal, what have you done with your daddy's legacy?" I didn't know it yet, standing there with cold coffee in my hand, but that question was about to lead me somewhere far darker than a boat sail. It was about to lead me into years of buried lies inside my own family. Years I'd been too close and too quiet to ever see clearly. And it started with a phone call I made not 20 minutes later to a boat dealer in Charleston who was about to tell me something that would change everything I thought I understood about my son. Before we get into what Mr. Freeman told me, ask yourself something. If the people closest to you had been quietly counting down a clock you didn't even know was running, would you have seen it coming? Naomi didn't. Not yet. But she was about to. I got dressed faster than I had in years. Didn't even bother combing out my hair proper. Just pulled on a cardigan and my good slacks and got in the car. Mount Pleasant to downtown Charleston isn't but 25 minutes if the Ravenel Bridge traffic is kind to you. And that morning, for once, it was. Mr. Freeman had known Darius for 30 years. 2 old black men who'd come up in the boat business together back when it wasn't easy for either of them. Still calling each other on Sunday afternoons just to argue about football. If anybody in Charleston would tell me the truth, it was him. His boatyard sat along the water, weathered gray buildings, the smell of diesel and salt and old varnish hanging over everything. He was standing outside when I pulled in, arms crossed, a look on his face I didn't like one bit. "Naomi," he said, and just the way he said my name told me something was wrong. "I've been sitting on that check. Didn't feel right releasing the funds. That power of attorney Jamal brought me, I've known that boy since he was in diapers, and something about that paper didn't sit right in my gut. He walked me back into the yard, and there she was. The Legacy, hauled up out of the water, sitting on blocks, sun catching on her chrome the way it always used to catch Darius's eye from clear across a parking lot. I went over her good before I even thought about cutting a check, Mr. Freeman said. Found something tucked behind the dash panel. Figured you ought to see it before any money changes hands. He handed me a small metal box, zip-tied shut, wedged so far behind the instrument panel I'd never have found it in 100 years of looking. My hands shook so bad it took 3 tries to cut the tie. Inside was a notebook in my husband's handwriting, a USB drive, and a small sealed envelope with my name on it, Naomi. I sat down on an overturned crate right there in that boatyard and opened the envelope. First, because some part of me already knew whatever was in that notebook was going to need bracing for. The letter was short. Darius never did waste words. Sweetheart, last month I caught Jamal at it again. This time he denied everything, flat out, looked me in the eye, and lied. I'm gathering more proof before I tell you the full truth. Don't trust anything he says about Aaliyah. I'll come to you the moment I'm certain. I read it twice, then a third time. My husband had known something was wrong and had carried it alone and had died before he ever got the chance to finish what he started. I felt 2 things crash into each other in my chest at once. A grief so sharp it nearly folded me in half because he'd been carrying this weight without me, the way he always tried to carry the heavy things without me. And underneath that grief, something almost like relief. He hadn't been fooled. My Darius had seen something true, even at the very end. I opened the notebook next. Page after page of dates, amounts, names. A vendor called North Shore Marine Supply that Darius had flagged with question marks in the margins. Invoices that didn't match delivered materials. Jamal's signature over and over, authorization after authorization, the dollar amounts climbing steadily quarter after quarter, like something feeding itself. I turned a page and found a line that made my hands go still. Payments routed to accounts, Cayman Islands. I had to set the notebook down on my knee just to keep my hands from shaking it out of focus. This was not a son who'd gotten a little careless with the family books. This was something built, something planned, something that had been running quietly under my nose for far longer than I wanted to think about. Every drama family carries someone who stays quiet too long, hoping the quiet will fix what words never could. I understood, sitting on that crate, that I had been that someone for 30 years. Mr. Freeman stood a respectful few feet off the whole time, watching the water instead of watching me, giving me what dignity he could. Naomi, he said finally, gently, whatever's in there, you don't have to figure it out today. But I think you need a lawyer before you need anything else. I called Miss Bennett from the boatyard. Cell phone pressed so hard against my ear, my hand ached. She'd handled Darius's business affairs for years, sharp as anybody I ever met, steady in a way I badly needed right then. Ms. Bennett, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. I need to bring you something today. It's bigger than I thought. I think my son has been stealing from his own father for years, and I think Darius knew. Bring it straight to my office, Naomi, she said. Everything. Don't call Jamal again until I've had a chance to look at it properly. I drove home along the harbor road with the notebook and the USB drive sitting on the passenger seat like something alive, something that might bite if I looked away too long. The marsh grass was turning gold the way it does every spring, herons standing still in the shallows like they hadn't a care in the world. And I remember thinking how strange it was that everything outside my windshield could look so peaceful, while something inside my chest was quietly coming apart. I pulled into my driveway, cut the engine, and sat a long minute before I could make myself go inside. Darius, I whispered, to nobody, to the empty car, to whatever was left of him, floating somewhere out past all that gold marsh grass. How much more did you keep from me? I didn't know yet that the notebook and the letter were only the surface, I didn't know that the video waiting on that USB drive, recorded by my husband himself 11 months before he died, belonged to an entirely different confrontation than the one he'd written to me about. Or that understanding the gap between those two moments would tell me almost everything I needed to know about how far this had really gone. If you've ever found out that the people you trusted most had been hiding something from you for longer than you can stand to think about, you already know exactly the ground Naomi was standing on. And it was about to shift again. Darius knew about the fraud a full year before he died, and chose to protect his son by staying silent instead of telling Naomi right away. Was that love? Or was it its own kind of betrayal? Team Darius or Team Naomi? Drop a 1 if you think he should have told her immediately, or a 2 if you think he was right to handle it quietly first. That night I sat alone in the living room of the house Darius and I raised our son in. Laptop open on the coffee table, the USB drive plugged in with hands that hadn't fully stopped shaking since the boatyard. There was only one video file on the drive. I clicked it before I could talk myself out of it. Darius's face filled the screen, and my chest seized up just seeing him again, hearing that low, steady voice I hadn't heard in 9 months except in memory. The angle told me he'd propped his phone up secretly on his workshop bench, recording a conversation he needed proof of. Jamal was in the frame too, arms crossed, jaw tight. A date stamp in the corner told me this was recorded 11 months before Darius died, nearly a year before the letter I'd just read in that boatyard, the one where he said Jamal had denied everything. This was a different night entirely, an earlier one. "I need to know the truth, son," Darius said, and his voice was so gentle it nearly undid me right there on the couch. "North Shore Marine Supply, explain it to me." Jamal's voice cracked on the recording. "Dad, it got complicated. I needed money. Aaliyah, she expects a certain kind of life, and I couldn't—" "Are you stealing from your own company, Jamal?" A long silence, then quietly, "I'll stop. I promise you, I'll stop." I heard my husband do the thing he always did, the thing that made him who he was. He forgave one more time. "Okay, son," he said, voice thick. "I believe you. Because you're my boy, and I love you, and everybody deserves one more chance to make it right." I sat in the dark of my living room and cried without a sound, because I could hear in my husband's voice that he was trying in that moment to save our son before it was too late. Watching my son's face crumble on that screen, I understood something about him I'd never let myself see clearly before. Jamal hadn't stolen because he was cruel. He'd stolen because somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself that his father's love came with a price tag he could never quite meet on his own. A business, a name, a legacy he felt he had to buy his way into rather than earn. The fear wasn't of getting caught. The fear was of being ordinary, of disappointing a man he could never say no to. That fear made him easy to lead, and somebody was already leading him. It hadn't worked. And now I understood why the letter in the boat read so differently. 11 months ago, Jamal had broken down and admitted it. But somewhere between that confession and the last month Darius mentioned in his letter, the scheme hadn't stopped. It had kept running. And when Darius came back to confront him a second time, Jamal didn't crack again. He'd had almost a year to get better at lying. This time he denied everything, cold, to his father's face. That was the confrontation Darius was still investigating when he died. 2 confrontations, 11 months apart. The first one, my husband forgave. The second one, he never lived long enough to finish. I almost stopped the video there. I almost couldn't take any more that night, but something made me open a second folder buried on that drive. One Darius had labeled simply A.C., Aaliyah Carter, my daughter-in-law's maiden name. Inside were bank statements, small transfers month after month over 2 full years, moving quietly from an account connected to Jamal's business into an account under the name of Aaliyah's mother, in a different state entirely. She had been building herself an exit for 2 years, long before anybody ever thought about selling a boat. Clipped to the printed statements was a sticky note in Darius's own careful handwriting. Transfers accelerated sharply after my first cardiac episode. They believe I won't be here much longer, and the money will belong to Jamal outright. They had been counting down the days until my husband died. I sat in the dark a long time after that, the glow of the laptop the only light in the room. And in that stillness, an old memory rose up on its own, one I'd kept folded away for months. I remembered calling Jamal from the hospital hallway the week Darius had his first heart scare, my voice cracking, asking him to please come home and help me sort through urgent paperwork the doctors needed signed. And I remembered my son's exact words back to me. "Mama, you're worrying too much. Let Dad handle it himself." I hadn't pushed. I hadn't wanted him to think his mother was weak or making too much of things. So I'd swallowed it, the way I'd swallowed so much over the years, and sat alone in that hallway and handled it myself, the way I always did. Sitting there now, with the truth spread across my coffee table in black and white bank records, I understood something for the first time with a clarity that felt almost violent. I was not just a woman who had been betrayed by her son. I was the only person left standing who could still do something about it. My hands had stopped shaking somewhere between that video and those bank statements. The grief hadn't left me, but something harder had grown up right alongside it, like new wood forming around an old wound. I called Miss Bennett again, past 10 o'clock at night, and she picked up on the second ring, like she'd been waiting. "There's more than we thought," I told her. "A lot more. I don't think this is a case for a family lawyer anymore, Ms. Bennett. I think this is a case for a forensic accountant." She didn't hesitate. "I'll bring one in first thing tomorrow. Naomi, are you all right?" I looked out my front window, past the porch swing that had been creaking since before Jamal was born, out toward the dark water I couldn't see from there but always knew was moving, steady, patient. "I don't know if I'm all right," I told her honestly, "but I know what I'm going to do next. I need copies of every company bank record going back 3 years, and I need to know exactly what a federal wire fraud case looks like from the inside." I sat alone at my kitchen table a long while after that call, the notebook, the letter, and the bank statements laid out in front of me like evidence at my own private trial. "They've been planning this longer than I ever let myself imagine," I said out loud to the empty house. But I stopped asking the hard questions a long time ago. Starting tonight, I'm asking them again. I had no way of knowing yet just how much worse the answers were going to get, or that within days I'd be sitting across my own kitchen table from the two people who owed me those answers most. If you've ever discovered that the people closest to you were counting down a clock you didn't even know was running, you understand exactly what kept Naomi awake that whole night. What happened next, when Jamal and Aaliyah finally walked back through her door, was something none of them saw coming. They flew back from Paris 4 days later, and I called them that same evening, my voice steadier than I felt. "Come to the house tonight, both of you, it's important." I set the notebook, the USB drive, and the sealed envelope out on the kitchen table under the same yellow light that had watched over 30 years of Sunday dinners in that house. I didn't set out coffee. I didn't set out anything for them. I just sat and I waited. They arrived a little past 9. Jamal, still travel-worn, tan from Paris, a kind of tired arrogance hanging off him like his expensive jacket. Aaliyah came in a step behind, phone already in her hand, eyes flicking around the kitchen like she was pricing the furniture. I didn't ask either of them to sit. "You sold the legacy," I said, calm as I could manage. "Now I need you to explain North Shore Marine Supply and the transfers to the Cayman Islands." Jamal's face went through 3 different expressions before he landed on one. "Mama, I just signed what Scott put in front of me. I didn't know all the details, I swear." His voice wavered on the last word. I'd heard that same waver on an 11-month-old recording, and it hadn't been true then either. Something in him cracked before he could stop it. His voice rose, sharp with panic he couldn't control. "We knew there was something on that boat. We just didn't know where. Dad used to say things, hints, like there was proof of something hidden somewhere on her. We couldn't search the whole thing without you noticing. Selling her was the only clean way to make the problem disappear." The kitchen went dead silent. Aaliyah's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing like ice forming over water. I looked my son square in the face, and something in me went very still. "So you didn't just sell your father's boat for a trip to Paris," I said, quiet, even. "You sold it because you were afraid of what might be hiding inside it. You didn't even know what. You just knew it could end you." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I felt something tear loose inside my chest. The last thread of belief that maybe my son had just been careless, just been weak, just been led astray. Standing in my own kitchen, I understood he hadn't only betrayed his father's memory. He had spent years being afraid of the truth without ever once being brave enough to face it, choosing instead to erase it. I thought of every Sunday after church, every dinner where somebody raised a glass to Darius as the backbone of this family, while my son sat there already carrying this fear. I thought of every time I told myself, he's just going through something, he'll come around, and swallowed the hurt instead of naming it out loud. Aaliyah spoke next, and her voice had gone flat and cold in a way that turned my blood to ice. "I only did what was necessary," she said, looking not at me, but at some fixed point past my shoulder, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed 100 times in her head. "Jamal had gambling debts. Serious ones. I helped him manage it. In exchange, he signed what I needed. Without me, he'd have been bankrupt years ago." Standing there listening to her, I finally understood what I was actually looking at. Aaliyah wasn't cruel for the sake of cruelty. She was terrified of ever again being the kind of woman who has nothing of her own, who depends entirely on a man's family for her safety. Control was the only language she trusted, because somewhere in her own history, losing control had clearly cost her everything once before. But the tragedy sitting in my kitchen that night was this. She had built her whole escape route out of someone else's family, brick by brick, and never once considered that the family she was robbing had already survived worse than her and would not go quietly. Jamal turned to look at his wife, and for one unguarded second, I saw something on my son's face I had never seen there before in 39 years. Not shame. Fear. Real, naked fear. Not of me, not of whatever law might be waiting behind me, but of the woman standing right beside him. I stood up slowly, one hand flat against the same kitchen table where I'd once helped Jamal with his multiplication tables, where Darius used to sit with a beer after long days at the boatyard, laughing about nothing at all. My voice came out low, but it did not shake. "Both of you need to leave my house. My lawyer will be in touch. Do not come back here." Jamal tried to say something, my name maybe, or some last excuse forming behind his teeth. But Aaliyah had already taken his arm and was pulling him toward the door, heels sharp against my hardwood floor, quick and final. The door closed. The house went quiet the way it does after a storm passes, that ringing kind of silence. I stood alone in my kitchen a long time, gripping the edge of that old wooden table, staring at the space where my son had just stood and lied to my face one final time. I thought about all those years of silence, mine and Darius's both, each of us trying to protect the other, trying to protect Jamal, trying to hold this family together with nothing but hope and good manners and Sunday dinners. No family drama plays out overnight. This one had been simmering quietly for years before it ever reached my kitchen table. I whispered it out loud, into the empty kitchen, and I meant every word of it. They've been planning around a fear I never even knew existed. And I stayed quiet for far too long. But not one more night. Not one more night. What I didn't know yet, standing there in that ringing silence, was that the evidence I'd gathered so far was only enough to start the fire, not enough on its own to finish it. It would take 6 more months, a federal courtroom in Charleston, and one final piece of paper I never expected before I understood exactly how far my husband had gone to protect me, and how completely my son had destroyed himself trying to outrun a threat that was never really on that boat at all. If you've ever sat across a table from someone you raised with your own 2 hands and realized you were looking at a stranger, You know exactly what that kitchen felt like that night. Naomi wasn't finished, not even close. Justice was coming, and it was coming from a place none of them expected. 6 months passed before that kitchen confrontation turned into a federal courtroom in Charleston. 6 months of depositions, of forensic accountants poring over North Shore Marine Supply's shell transactions, of federal investigators tracing wire transfers that hopped from South Carolina to the Cayman Islands and back again like they were trying to shake off a scent. 6 months of Miss Bennett calling me steady and often, walking me through what wire fraud meant, what forgery meant, what it meant that my daughter-in-law had quietly built an offshore account structure 2 full years before anybody ever thought to sell a boat. I sat in the 3rd row of the courtroom gallery on the day it mattered most, dressed simple and dark, my hands folded in my lap the way my own mother taught me to sit in church. Jamal stood at the defense table looking thinner than I'd ever seen him, the polish gone clean out of him. Aaliyah sat beside him, spine straight, chin up, eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, like none of this was quite real to her yet. Miss Bennett laid it all out for the court, piece by piece. Darius's notebook, the recorded confrontation, the hidden folder of transfers to Aaliyah's mother, testimony from Mr. Freeman about the box behind the dash panel, and a company vice president who confirmed the fraudulent invoicing scheme had run for nearly 3 years before Darius ever caught wind of it. Copies of letters Darius had quietly mailed to his own attorney in the final months of his life were entered into evidence too, each one a small brick in a wall he'd been building without me ever knowing it existed. The jury didn't take long. Jamal was convicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and forgery, 7 years. Aaliyah, found to be the true architect behind the offshore accounts and the larger transfers, was sentenced to 9. When the judge read the sentence, Jamal turned around in his seat and looked at me for the first time since that night in my kitchen. What I saw on his face wasn't anger anymore. It was regret, arriving about 3 years too late to do either of us any good. Aaliyah never turned around at all. She kept her chin high and her eyes on the flag behind the judge's bench, like looking at me might cost her something she wasn't willing to spend. I did not cry in that courtroom. I gripped the edge of the wooden bench in front of me, and in my mind, I saw my husband standing on our dock at sunrise, and I saw myself, at 29 years old, 7 months pregnant, signing my name to a loan I had no business signing alone. Every quiet sacrifice I had ever made, every year I never spoke of, felt in that moment like it had finally been seen by somebody other than me. The restitution the court ordered wasn't enough to undo 3 years of theft, but it was enough for what I needed to do next. I drove to Mr. Freeman's boatyard myself and bought the legacy back at a fair price, no discounts asked or given, and had her towed home to the same dock behind my house where Darius first taught Jamal how to tie a bowline knot, back before any of this ever started. With what remained, I started the Darius Washington Fund, scholarships and small business grants for young Black men and women across the Charleston area who wanted to learn boat building, woodworking, honest trades built with patient hands, the same kind of trade that had built our whole life together from nothing. I drove home from the courthouse that evening with the windows cracked, marsh air pouring in warm and salty the way it always does in a Charleston summer, and I said it out loud to the empty car, the way I'd taken to talking to Darius ever since he'd been gone. I got a piece of it back today, honey. The truth, and some measure of what's fair. But there's one more piece of paperwork sitting at Miss Bennett's office, and something tells me I'm not quite finished yet. I didn't know yet, pulling into my own driveway that evening, that Miss Bennett had one final document sitting in her office safe. Something Darius had mailed her under strict, written instructions 2 months before he died, sealed, not to be opened except under one very specific condition. That one envelope was about to turn everything I thought I understood about my son's crime completely inside out. If you've ever watched justice finally catch up to someone who hurt your family, you know that strange, mixed feeling of relief that doesn't quite settle all the way into peace. Naomi felt that too, but her story wasn't over. The final piece of the truth was still waiting for her, not on the water this time, but in a locked drawer that had been sitting quietly unopened the whole time. I went to see Miss Bennet one last time to close out the estate paperwork, thinking the hardest parts were finally behind me. Her office looked the same as it always had. Law books lined up like soldiers, coffee gone lukewarm in a mug by her elbow, the blinds throwing thin stripes of afternoon light across her desk. I remember thinking, walking in, that I was almost disappointed there wasn't more left to feel. I was wrong about that, too. "There's one more thing, Mrs. Washington," she said, sliding a thin, sealed folder across her desk. Her hands were steady, but she took a breath before she spoke. The kind of breath a person takes before they hand you something heavier than paper. 2 months before he passed, Darius mailed our office this document with written instructions attached. He asked that it stay sealed unless a very specific set of circumstances came to pass, namely, if his estate ever became the subject of a criminal proceeding. Given the verdict last month, that condition has now been met. I sat very still while she opened it and explained. Darius had quietly rewritten his estate in the final months of his life, cutting out the ambiguous language that had left room for Jamal to claim boatyard assets outright, and instead directing everything, the business, the property, and the legacy herself, to me, and to any charitable fund I chose to establish in his name. "Why didn't he just tell me?" I asked her, and I heard my own voice crack on it, the first time it had cracked in months. Ms. Bennet folded her hands on the desk. "I asked myself that too, when I first read his instructions," she said. "I think he was trying to protect you from carrying the suspicion before there was proof to carry. He didn't want you living under that weight the way he was, not unless it became truly necessary." She paused. "I think he also knew that if Jamal ever found out there was a document like this, sitting in a lawyer's safe, he might have panicked in a whole different direction. Darius wanted you protected no matter which way this went. This was his way of making sure of it, even from the grave." I sat with that a long while, turning it over the way you turn over a stone you've had in your pocket so long its edges are already smooth. He'd never trusted the boat as a hiding place. He knew Jamal had access to it, knew it wasn't safe. So he'd done the opposite of what I expected. He sent the one document that actually mattered somewhere his son could never reach it at all, and left the boat holding nothing but a warning, which meant that when Jamal sold that boat, terrified of some vague danger he couldn't even name, he hadn't destroyed the evidence that would have saved him. The real safeguard had never been on that boat to begin with. Sitting with that final piece of paper, I finally saw my son whole, in a way grief and anger had kept me from seeing him before. Jamal's real tragedy was never greed alone. It was that he had spent his whole adult life so afraid of being caught falling short that he never let himself simply come home and say, "Dad, I made a mistake. Help me fix it." That fear, not the fraud itself, was the thing that actually destroyed him. His father had already built him a way back. Jamal never asked for it, because asking would have meant admitting he needed saving in the first place. He had spent years being afraid of the wrong thing, and in trying to outrun a threat he never understood, he'd walked away from the one chance his father had quietly left him to make things right. I drove straight to the dock that evening, climbed down into the Legacy the way I had 1,000 times over 25 years, and sat there alone while the Charleston harbor wind moved soft across the water. The varnish smell hit me the second I climbed down into her, that particular sweetness of tongue oil and years, and it undid something in me faster than any courtroom ever had. I ran my palm flat along the dashboard where Mr. Freeman had found that little metal box, and I thought about my husband, alone in this boathouse some night 11 months before he died, hands shaking, just like mine were shaking now, hiding away a truth he wasn't ready to hand me yet. I thought about myself at 29, signing my name in the dark at that same kitchen table 200 yards from where I now sat, betting everything I had on a man I trusted completely. I thought about the job in Atlanta I never took, the accounting career that might have been mine, folded up and put away so many years ago I'd nearly forgotten it had ever been a real choice and not simply what a good wife did. Funny, I thought, how a woman can spend 40 years building somebody else's legacy, and only discover in her 69th year that she'd been building her own the whole time without ever once being asked if she wanted the job. I sat there a long while, letting it all settle. Not for the boat, not for the money, not even for my son sitting in a prison cell for years he'd earned all on his own. I cried because every quiet year I'd spent swallowing my own hurt, every sacrifice nobody ever mentioned again, every night I told myself silence was the same thing as love, had led, somehow, to this exact moment. My son hadn't just betrayed me. He had spent his whole adult life so afraid of being caught that he never once let himself simply come home and tell the truth. And that fear, in the end, cost him everything his father had actually tried to save for him. I wiped my face, looked out over the dark water, and spoke to the only person who ever really understood what all that silence had cost me. I finished it, Darius, I said, soft, steady. Every last piece. And I'm sorry it took me so long to stop being quiet. I climbed off the boat, turned off the dock light, and walked back up to the house. My phone buzzed once on the kitchen counter, a message from the correctional facility. Jamal. Part of me, the part that used to drive across town at midnight because Jamal skinned his knee on a curb, the part that sat up nights waiting for headlights to swing into the driveway when he was 17 and reckless. That part of me wanted to read it. Wanted, God help me, to find some kind of apology worth forgiving. But I thought of the notebook and the recording and my son's face going through 3 different lies before he ever tried the truth. And I understood that whatever was on that screen, it would ask something of me I did not yet have to give. Maybe someday. Not that night. I looked at that screen a long, long time. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and left it there. Some wounds don't close just because the truth finally comes out. But my husband's legacy and my own would be protected now, for good, no matter what came next. And like every drama family that finally reaches its reckoning, mine didn't end with a clean bow tied around it. It ended with me still standing, still whole, still choosing honesty over comfort, one ordinary morning at a time. Outside, the marsh was doing what it always does at that hour, turning that particular shade of blue gold that Darius used to call boat builder's light, the last good light of the day for seeing true grain in wood. I stood at the window a moment just to watch it, the way he taught me to all those years ago. And then I turned back to my kitchen, to my tea, to whatever ordinary evening was left to me. I sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, looking at an old photograph of Darius and me, standing together on that same dock, decades younger, both of us laughing at something neither of us could probably even remember anymore. And I said softly, to the quiet of my own kitchen, betrayal can take an awful lot from you, but it cannot take the truth. And the truth always belongs, in the end, to the ones brave enough to speak it. This story reminds us that grief and betrayal often show up wearing the same quiet clothes, and most of us won't recognize either one until we're already standing in the middle of it. If you're sitting alone tonight in a house that used to be full of noise, here's something practical rather than pretty. Call one person this week, a sister, an old church friend, even the neighbor on your porch, and tell them one true thing you've been carrying by yourself. Ask your bank for a plain summary of every account with your name on it, this month, not someday, so nobody can quietly move a dollar without you knowing. If you have a will tucked in a drawer somewhere, take it out and read every line out loud, because paper only protects you if you actually know what it says. And if a grown child ever tells you something is already handled, ask to see it anyway. Real love was never the same thing as blindness. Naomi didn't heal by simply moving past her son. She healed by refusing, finally, to let silence make her decisions for her. That's not a slogan you hang on the wall. That's just an ordinary Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, choosing to ask one more honest question than you did the day before.